Dying doesn't feel like falling asleep. It doesn't feel like anything you've seen in a movie or read about in a book. It feels like, and I know how this sounds, it feels like finally putting down something you didn't know you'd been carrying your whole life. And in that moment, when I had no heartbeat, no blood pressure, no measurable brain activity for 38 minutes, a presence stood in front of me and told me to tell you to move your money. I need you to stay with me. Because I know how that sounds, and I know exactly what your first instinct is when you hear a man say something like that. I know because I would have had the same instinct. I am not a pastor. I am not a prophet. I am not someone who is looking for a spiritual experience. I am a certified public accountant. I spent 27 years doing tax strategy and pension fund auditing and financial risk assessment for businesses. My whole life was built on one premise, that numbers do not lie. That if you look at the actual data, not the narrative someone is selling you about the data, but the data itself, you will find the truth. That was how I lived for 58 years. And then I died. And what I saw when I was dead changed everything I thought I understood about where the real numbers are kept. I need you to subscribe to this channel before we go further, because what I was shown is not a single account. It is part of a record being built, and you are someone who needs to stay close to that record. And I want to ask you something in the comments when we are done. What is the one thing in your financial life you have been not looking at? The one position you know is too exposed. Write it. We will come back to that. It was a Tuesday in March of 2022. I had driven into Columbus the way I had driven into Columbus 1,000 times before. Same route. Same coffee from the same gas station on Fifth Avenue. I had a quarterly review with a client that morning, a mid-size manufacturing company I had been auditing for 11 years. I knew their books better than I knew my own family's schedule. I had been up since 5 preparing for the presentation. I had my legal pad. I had my laptop. I had spent Sunday afternoon at the kitchen table going over the numbers the way I did every Sunday. A ritual my wife Carol called my version of church, and she was not entirely wrong about that. I sat down at the conference table. I opened my laptop. I said something to the client's CFO, something ordinary, something about the Q4 numbers showing a pattern we needed to discuss. I remember the exact quality of light in that room. There were floor-to-ceiling windows facing east, and the morning sun was coming in at a low angle, and the light had that particular flat brightness you get in Ohio in March, when the sky has cleared after rain. That is the last ordinary detail I remember. What I felt next started as pressure, not pain, not yet. Pressure behind my sternum, a fist of something that pushed rather than stabbed. I told myself it was indigestion. I had skipped breakfast. I excused myself from the conference table. I walked into the corridor, and then I was on the floor. What happened over the next 38 minutes is in the medical record at Ohio Health Riverside Methodist Hospital, signed by the cardiologist on duty and the emergency response team. Massive myocardial infarction, caused by a blockage that had been building for years in my left anterior descending artery, the widowmaker they call it, and that name is medically accurate. My colleague from the firm performed CPR in the corridor for 11 minutes before the paramedics arrived. The defibrillator was used 3 times in the ambulance. I was declared clinically dead. No viable heartbeat. No measurable blood pressure. By the time I arrived at the emergency bay, I had been without a functioning heart for a documented 38 minutes. The cardiologist who led the resuscitation team told Carol afterward that there was no clinical explanation for the absence of brain damage. None. He had expected, at best, significant cognitive impairment. He told her that sometimes, rarely, there are outcomes that the data cannot fully account for. He was choosing his words carefully, the way professionals do when the numbers don't add up and they don't want to say that out loud. I understand that instinct completely. I lived inside that instinct for 27 years. What the medical record does not contain is what happened to me during those 38 minutes. I did not go out like a light. I want to be precise about this because it matters. Consciousness did not switch off. It unwound. There was a moment. I was still in the corridor. I could feel the floor. I could hear my colleague's voice. And then there was something underneath that. Something like a radio signal losing its station. You can still hear the signal, but it is underneath static. And then the static was all there was. And then, and this is the transition I cannot explain to anyone who has not experienced it, the static stopped. Not gradually, immediately. One moment there was static. The next moment there was somewhere else. No tunnel, no gradual brightening. A threshold. I crossed it and I was somewhere else entirely, with a completeness and an immediacy that made the corridor feel like a dream I had been having and had just woken from. I was aware of myself. That is the first thing I want to tell you because it surprised me more than anything else. I was still me. Not a version of me or a distillation of me. Me. With all the specific weight and history and habit of being Gary Whitmore. But the body was gone, and what I understood immediately, not thought, not reasoned, understood the way you understand that you are cold or that you are hungry, was that I had been carrying the body the way you carry a bag that has been on your shoulder so long you forget it is there. And I had put it down, and I was still me. What I saw next is the reason I am telling you this. And I need you to hear it because I believe it was meant for you as much as it was meant for me. The first thing I became aware of was a quality of presence. Not a figure, not yet. A quality. The best word I have for it, and I want you to understand that I am a man who has spent his entire adult life finding the precise word for a precise thing. And this word is inadequate. The best word I have is warmth. But it was not temperature. It was not the warmth of a room or a blanket. It was the warmth of being recognized, of being completely seen and known and recognized, down to the parts of yourself that you have never said out loud to anyone, down to the parts that you are not entirely sure you understand yourself. Seen completely, with no surprise, with no judgment, with something I can only call gladness, as if you were expected, as if the fact that you arrived was not just known, but anticipated and welcomed. And then there was a smell. I know how that sounds. I know what I am claiming when I say I perceived a smell in a state in which I had no body, no nose, no olfactory nerve. I know the physiology. I am not confused about what I am saying. What I am saying is that there was a quality to the presence that the word smell is the closest approximation I have. And the description I always come back to is this: sunlight on old wood. The inside of my grandfather's barn in Carroll County in August, when I was 9 years old before he sold the farm. That specific, that particular, that precise. I have not smelled that smell in the physical world in nearly 50 years, and it was there. unmistakably, as if it had always been there, waiting for me to be somewhere quiet enough to notice it. I stood inside that presence. Stood is wrong, there was no standing, but I was there. And the presence was there, and there was a relationship of proximity that felt like standing. And then the presence resolved. Not into a shape I could describe anatomically, into a quality of knowing that I recognized the way you recognize a voice you have heard before you see the face. I knew who this was, not because I was told, not because there was a name spoken, because something in me that had always known was suddenly no longer buried under the weight of 30 years of not paying attention to it. I am not going to tell you what to believe about that. I am telling you what I experienced. What I am going to tell you is what happened next. Because what happened next was not comfort. It was not a soft light and a message about how much I was loved. Those things were present. I am not dismissing them. But what arrived with them, delivered in the same warmth, in the same quality of unconditional recognition, was specific, clinical, the kind of specific that a man who has spent his career reading financial instruments would recognize and could not have invented for himself. I was shown a system. I want you to understand what I mean when I use that word. I mean a system the way an engineer means it. Interconnected parts with interdependencies, inputs and outputs, load-bearing elements and decorative elements. I had worked inside this system my entire professional life without ever seeing it from the outside. What the experience gave me was the view from outside. And from outside, what I saw was this: the system that most Americans depend on to preserve the value of everything they have worked for is not built the way most Americans believe it is built. I am not going to give you an investment lecture. That is not what I was sent back to do. What I was shown was not a spreadsheet. It was an architecture. And the architecture had a problem that any structural engineer would have identified immediately, which is that a significant number of the walls that looked load-bearing were decorative. They were there for the appearance of stability. They were not actually holding anything up. And I was shown, not told, shown, the way you show someone a building by taking them inside it. What happens when the decorative walls are asked to bear real load? What I saw was not a single catastrophic event. That is important. What I was shown was a sequence, a cascade. It begins from what I saw with a loss of confidence, not in any single institution, but in the underlying premise. The premise that paper holds value because enough people agree that it does. I watched, from somewhere above it, the moment when that agreement begins to unravel. And what I understood, the way you understand something when you are standing inside total knowing rather than reasoning toward it, is that the unraveling was not a surprise to the system. The system had been running on borrowed time for longer than most people realized. And the people who built and managed the system knew this. And then I was shown the people who had prepared, and the people who had not. I need you to sit with that for a moment. Not the collapse, the distinction. Because the experience was not about destruction. The experience was about positioning. I was shown, and I choose that word deliberately, that there was a specific, decisive difference between the outcomes available to the people who had moved their resources in time and the outcomes available to the people who had not. And the difference was not about wealth. It was about stability. The people I was shown who had moved their money were not wealthy in what came after. They were stable. That is what the warning is. That is the whole of it. Move your money not to save yourself. Move your money so that you have something left to give. You are watching this and you may be thinking, I am not wealthy. This is not a message for me. I want to address that directly because I was a middle-class accountant from a suburb of Columbus, Ohio. My family was not wealthy. What I moved was not a fortune. It was enough. And enough was the word that was given to me specifically. Not more than enough. Enough. Positioned correctly. Out of the instruments that would become worthless and into the forms that would hold value regardless of what confidence in the paper system did. I cannot tell you what those forms are for your specific situation. What I was shown was directional, not prescriptive. What I can tell you is that the distinction is one you are already capable of making. You already know, if you look honestly at your own financial life, which of what you hold is dependent on the system's continued confidence to have value, and which of what you hold would hold value regardless. I was shown my own life review. I need to tell you what that was like, because the phrase life review does not carry the weight of what I experienced. It sounds like a highlights reel. It sounds like a summary. It was not. It was an audit. It was the most thorough and honest audit I have ever encountered, and I have encountered a great many audits in my professional life. Every financial decision I had made in 27 years of practice appeared before me, not as a list, not sequentially, but simultaneously and from every angle at once. And what I understood standing inside that was that money is not a number. Money is trust. Specifically, money is the physical form that human trust takes when it passes between people. I want you to sit with that because it is not a metaphor. It is the most precise description I have of what I was shown. Every dollar I had ever managed for a client was a unit of that client's trust. When I honored that trust, and I often did, I was a good accountant for most of my career. I felt the weight of it return to me multiplied. Not as money, as something I cannot name that was better than money in the way that water is better than a drawing of water. And when I hadn't honored it, the times I recommended instruments slightly more aggressive than a client's actual risk profile because the fee structure rewarded me for it, the times I optimized for the metric I was being measured on rather than the metric that actually mattered to the human being trusting me, I felt the weight of the trust that had nowhere to go. I want to be clear about something. The review was not a punishment. There was no judgment in it in the sense that you might fear judgment. What it was a clarification, a showing of what money actually is, from the perspective of what it actually does to and for human beings. I was being shown the real ledger, not the ledger I had been keeping for 27 years, the numbers-denominated one. The ledger where the actual value is recorded. And here is what the real ledger showed me about the system I had worked inside my entire career. The system has been keeping two sets of books. One set for what it presents to the public. One set for what is actually happening. I knew this in the vague, professionally uncomfortable way that most people in finance know it. You don't look too closely at certain things because looking too closely would make certain things impossible to continue doing. What the review showed me was what the second set of books actually says. And what it says is that the gap between the two has become a canyon. And canyons eventually are either bridged or fallen into. This is the part I have spent 2 years not saying out loud. What I was shown was not a metaphor. It was not a symbolic vision of a nation drifting from its values. It was specific, structural. What I was shown through the lens of the real ledger is that the instruments most people in this country believe are safe, the instruments they are counting on to sustain them through the next decade of their lives, are on the wrong side of the canyon. They are in the part of the architecture that looks load-bearing but is not. And the period between now and when that becomes undeniable is shorter than most people's financial planning horizon. You have been sensing this. I want to say that directly, without qualification. If you are watching this video, there is a reason you are watching this video. You did not find this by accident. You have been sensing for some time, maybe years, that something is structurally wrong with what you have been told is stable. You have felt it the way you feel weather before it arrives. That feeling is not anxiety. That feeling is not paranoia. That feeling is information, and it has been trying to reach you. I was sent back to confirm it, specifically and plainly, in the language of a man who spent his career inside the system and was given for 38 minutes the view from outside it. Move your money. I want to stop here and make sure you hear those 3 words the way they were given to me. Not as panic. Not as a directive to burn your financial life to the ground. Move your money. The way you move something valuable when the forecast changes. The way a farmer moves the harvest inside before the storm arrives. Careful, deliberate, ahead of the urgency, not frantic, intentional. What changed in me after I came back, and I want to be honest with you about the cost of this, because this is the part that most people do not want to talk about, is that I could no longer see the system the way I had seen it for 27 years. I could not go back to the conference room with the east-facing windows and open the laptop and present the quarterly numbers as if the only thing those numbers were measuring was what was on the spreadsheet. I could see what was underneath the spreadsheet. I resigned my partnership 4 months after I returned. My partners thought I had experienced some kind of post-cardiac event psychological deterioration. My financial advisor called Carol to ask if everything was all right at home. I understood their concern. I would have had the same concern about a colleague who had done what I did. What I actually did was reposition. I moved a portion of our family's savings out of the instruments I had been shown were on the wrong side of the canyon. Not all of it, not recklessly, enough. And I sat with the knowledge that I had been given for 2 years, telling only Carol and my oldest son, waiting to understand what I was supposed to do with it. What changed that, what finally broke the silence, was a phone call from a woman I had served as a client for 15 years. A retired school teacher in her late 60s who had done everything right, saved carefully, diversified reasonably, trusted the institutions that her financial advisor told her to trust. She called me after a bank failure. She had lost a portion of her savings she could not afford to lose. She was not destitute. She was shaken. And she called me and asked me what I thought she should do. And I realized, standing in my kitchen holding the phone, that I had been given the answer to that question 2 years before. And I had been holding it as if it were mine to keep. It wasn't mine to keep. It was never mine to keep. It was given to me to give. So here I am, giving it. This is what this testimony cost me to share. My professional reputation among people who knew me in the life I had before. My credibility as a man who dealt in numbers and facts and verifiable reality. The comfortable silence that allowed me to be someone who knew something and did not have to do anything about knowing it. Every one of those things was a price I was willing to pay to say what I am saying to you now. Not because I want anything from you, because the retired school teacher called me. And behind her there are 10,000 other people who called no one, who had no one to call, who will not be told in time because the people who knew were keeping it to themselves. I am not keeping it to myself anymore. Here is what I am asking you to do this week. One thing. Take out a legal pad or a piece of paper, it does not matter, just something that exists in the physical world and not on a screen. And write down every financial instrument you hold, every account, every asset, every retirement fund, every savings vehicle, every investment position. Write them down. And then, next to each one, write one word: dependent or independent. Dependent on the continued confidence of the financial system to hold its value, or independent of that confidence, something that holds value regardless of what happens to the paper and the promises. You already know which is which. I want to be clear about that. You are not going to need a financial advisor to complete this exercise. You are not going to need to look anything up. You know. The same part of you that has been sensing the structural problem for years already knows which of what you hold is real and which is confidence dependent. What I am asking you to do is look at the list when it is finished and ask yourself, if the confidence broke, which column is your survival in? That is the question I was sent back to ask you, not by me, by something that knew your name before you were born and knows exactly what you are carrying right now, today, in 2026, and cared enough to send someone back through 38 minutes of clinical death to make sure you heard it. You are watching this for a reason. I want you to know that I do not say that as a comfort or as a content strategy. I say it because it is precisely what I was told. I was told, in that warmth, in that quality of being completely known, that what I was being shown was not for me alone. I was told that the warning would reach the people it was meant to reach, that the instrument through which it arrived would matter, because the people who needed to hear a financial warning from a professional who had lived inside the system their entire career and had been given the outside view, those people would not hear it from a pastor or a prophet. They would hear it from someone who spent his career reading balance sheets. I am that person, and you found this. And I do not believe that is an accident. If this testimony reached you, if even one part of it landed, if you felt something in your chest when I described the 2 sets of books, if something in you recognized the canyon I described, I want to ask you to subscribe to this channel. Not for me, because what I shared here is one account among many, and the accounts are building a record that I believe matters, and I believe you are someone who understands why that record matters. The button is below. It takes 2 seconds. And in the comments, I want to ask you something specific. I want to ask you, what is the one thing in your financial life that you have been not looking at? You know what it is. The thing you told yourself you would deal with later. The position you know is too exposed. The dependency you have been hoping won't be tested. Write it. Not because I will judge it, because saying it out loud is sometimes the difference between the thing that keeps building and the thing that you finally address. Write it this week, in the comments, or in the privacy of your own legal pad, but write it. I came back to Columbus in a body that had been dead for 38 minutes, with a cardiologist who could not explain why there was no brain damage, with a whiteboard in my home office that I have never written on again, and with 3 words that were given to me in a warmth I cannot fully describe, by a presence I recognized before I was told who it was. Move your money. I am telling you because I was told to tell you. I am telling you because the retired school teacher called me. I am telling you because I spent 2 years keeping it as if it were mine to keep, and it is not mine to keep, and I am done keeping it. Whatever is coming, and something is coming, the data says so and the beyond said so. And in my experience, those 2 sources reaching the same conclusion at the same time is worth paying attention to. I hope this reaches you in time to act. I hope you take the legal pad out this week. I hope you write the list. I hope you look at the 2 columns and do what you already know needs to be done. That is all I was sent back to ask.